Imagine a giant, nearly 10 feet tall, his armor weighing more than 100 pounds, his spear like a tree trunk, and his voice thundering across the battlefield. For 40 days, no one dared to face him, until one day, a boy with nothing but a sling stepped forward and changed history forever. This is not just a story about an underdog. It's the story of courage, faith, and the moment when the impossible was shattered. Let's dive into one of the most legendary confrontations in history, David versus Goliath. The sun had barely risen over the Valley of Elah, but already the air was thick with tension. Two armies faced one another across the shallow valley, Israel on one ridge, the Philistines on the opposite slope. Between them stretched open ground, an unspoken invitation to battle. The Israelites stood rigid, spears clutched tightly, eyes scanning the horizon with dread. They had come prepared for war, yet something far more terrifying than a massed army awaited them. From the Philistine line, a figure emerged. The ground seemed to shudder beneath each step, metal clanging with every movement. He was no ordinary warrior. His name was Goliath of Gath, the Philistine champion. Towering above the crowd, his presence alone seemed to bend the morale of the battlefield. His frame, recorded in ancient texts as nearly 10 feet tall, though some manuscripts suggest closer to 7 feet, was still extraordinary, a man who dwarfed even the tallest of his peers. To the soldiers of Israel, the exact measurement did not matter. He was a giant and he was invincible. On his head rested a bronze helmet, glinting in the early light. His body was wrapped in a coat of scale armor, overlapping metal plates that weighed over 100 pounds, about the weight of a modern soldier's full combat gear. Each step he took was a thunderclap of intimidation. A massive spear rested in his grip, the shaft as thick as a weaver's beam, its iron head alone weighing 15 pounds, more than some of the swords carried by the men of Israel. Before him marched a shield-bearer, carrying a shield so large it could conceal a grown man. It was as if the Philistines wanted to remind their enemies, even our strongest warrior is too mighty to stand alone. For 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath stepped into the valley and hurled his challenge. Choose a man to fight me. If he wins, we will be your servants. But if I prevail, you will serve us. His voice carried across the hills like a drumbeat of doom. The Israelites trembled. No one dared answer. Even King Saul, tall among his own men, remained silent, knowing he was no match for the monster below. The challenge was more than physical. It was psychological warfare. Each time Goliath appeared, he chipped away at Israel's courage. Each night, the echo of his words haunted the camp. Soldiers awoke in cold sweats, ashamed of their fear yet unable to conquer it. By the 40th day, the valley itself seemed to belong to Goliath. And then, unexpectedly, another figure entered the scene. He was no soldier, no seasoned warrior hardened by years of battle. He was a shepherd boy, perhaps still in his teens, carrying not a sword or spear but loaves of bread and cuts of cheese. His name was David, the youngest son of Jesse of Bethlehem. His mission was not to fight but to deliver supplies to his brothers and bring back word of their welfare. To the men at the front, he must have seemed laughably out of place, a boy in a world of warriors. But history often turns on the least expected of arrivals. David descended into the camp just as the war cry rose, the Israelites rushing to form battle lines. He dropped his supplies with the baggage keeper and hurried to find his brothers. As he greeted them, a familiar roar shook the valley. The Philistine champion had returned, bellowing insults at Israel and mocking the God they served. The reaction was immediate. Soldiers recoiled, fleeing from the front lines, eyes wide with terror. For David, this was his first encounter with Goliath. Unlike the others, he had not endured 40 days of torment. He saw the giant not through the eyes of fear but through the lens of faith. To him, the true insult was not against Israel's army but against the living God. Outraged, he turned to the men around him and asked, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" In that moment, something shifted. Amid the despair of an army paralyzed by fear, one voice spoke with defiance, not in arrogance but in conviction. A boy had asked the question that no man dared, "Why not me?" The figure that emerged from the Philistine ranks was unlike anything most men had ever seen. Goliath of Gath was not simply tall. He was a living monument of intimidation, a man whose very presence seemed to bend the battlefield to his will. Ancient texts describe his height as 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet, 9 inches by traditional measurement. Other ancient manuscripts record a shorter but still formidable stature, closer to 6 feet 9 inches. Whether 10 feet or 7, in a world where the average man stood barely over 5.5 feet, Goliath was a towering anomaly. To the Israelites staring across the valley, he looked less like a man and more like a walking fortress. He wore a bronze helmet that caught the sun, blazing like fire across the field. His body was covered in a coat of scale armor, plates of bronze that overlapped like the scales of a serpent. This armor weighed more than 125 pounds, equivalent to the full combat load of a modern soldier. Yet Goliath bore it as though it were little more than cloth, striding with ease. The sheer sight of a man able to move fluidly under such a burden told the Israelites everything they needed to know. This was not someone you could simply outmuscle. His legs were wrapped in bronze greaves, gleaming with every step, and slung across his back was a bronze javelin. In his massive hands, however, rested his most terrifying weapon, a spear whose shaft was as thick as a weaver's beam, a sturdy wooden rod used in ancient looms. Its iron tip alone weighed 15 pounds. For comparison, many soldiers' entire swords weighed less than 3. To face such a weapon in the hands of such a man was to stare at death itself. And then there was the shield bearer. Before Goliath marched another man carrying a shield so massive it could cover an entire body. To need another soldier just to carry part of your defense was not weakness, it was spectacle. The Philistines wanted Israel to see that their champion was not merely one man. He was a one-man army. Every detail of Goliath's appearance was engineered to inspire terror. His size was an advantage, but his true weapon was psychological. Imagine the sound of his armor grinding as he walked, the way his shadow stretched across the valley floor. Every clang of bronze was a drumbeat of dread. When he stopped, he raised his voice, and the air itself seemed to tremble. "Why have you come out to line up for battle?" he thundered. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him, then you shall be our servants." This was no reckless taunt. It was a calculated proposal rooted in an ancient tradition known as representative combat. In the East, it was not uncommon for two armies to avoid massive bloodshed by selecting champions to fight on behalf of their people. One duel would decide the fate of thousands. For the Philistines, Goliath was that champion, their walking guarantee of victory. But Goliath's confidence carried more than custom. It carried arrogance. He taunted not just Israel but Israel's God. Day after day, his booming voice echoed through the valley. "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." The effect was devastating. Men who had once been eager for battle now shrank at the very thought of stepping forward. Each time Goliath appeared, Israel's courage eroded a little more. Soldiers whispered among themselves, their voices trembling. Who could face him? Who would dare? Even King Saul, the tallest Israelite, a man once chosen for his commanding stature, stood in silence, unwilling to risk everything in single combat with the Philistine giant. The valley became a stage, and Goliath the star actor, his performance a daily humiliation of Israel. With every stride, every roar, every clang of bronze, he reinforced a singular truth: no one could defeat him, or so it seemed. For the men of Israel, Goliath was not merely an opponent. He was the embodiment of fear itself. He was the mountain they could not climb, the storm they could not endure. And until someone stepped forward, the valley belonged to him. The Valley of Elah woke every morning to the same metallic rumor. Armor clattering in the Philistine camp, a low drum of footfalls that made dust leap off the ground in tiny puffs. The Israelites learned to read the light by that sound. When the sun climbed to a certain angle and burned the mist from the ridges, he would appear, the champion from Gath, a bulk of bronze and confidence that seemed to tilt the valley toward him. He did not hurry. The slowness was part of the ritual, a signal that nothing in Israel could interrupt his stride. He moved the way a storm moves, not faster for your fear, not slower for your prayers. Men tried not to stare, but eyes betray the will when dread is present. Some busied their hands with straps and buckles, polishing the same patch of leather as if shinier gear might make a difference. Others kept their gaze on the ground, counting the pebbles under their sandals, as though arithmetic could hold courage together. The giant's bronze helmet caught the sun and flung it back, and the plates of his coat overlapped like the scales of some engineered dragon. His javelin rode his back. His spear, thicker than any staff the Israelites had ever seen, rested across his shoulders as though it weighed nothing. In front of him, a man carried a shield so tall it could hide a body. That detail mattered to the Israelites. It meant the Philistine came with his own scenery, a performance with props. Fear does not stay still. It ferments, and the air it makes is heavy. Around the cooking fires, men spoke softly so their courage wouldn't hear them losing it. Rumor grew around the giant like vines. He was taller each night, his spear heavier, his armor thicker, his laughter sharper. Some declared they had seen dents on his helmet from earlier duels, proof that others had tried and failed. Others swore he had the stride of two men, that he crossed ground faster than a horse. Normal fear would have corrected them, but normal fear had been replaced by its older cousin, the kind that prefers exaggeration because exaggeration makes an action look wise. Saul kept his tent with its front closed more often than not. The men wanted to believe he was planning. That strategy required privacy. Once, he emerged in full gear, and a murmur of hope passed through the ranks like the breeze before rain. He walked the ridge with his captains, pointing toward rocks and trees as if terrain might volunteer to fight for them. But the king who stood taller than his people felt smaller than the problem, and when the giant's voice rolled up the slope, Saul's chin dipped just slightly, the way a candle bows before a draft. His silence dripped down the chain of command, pooling in the hearts of men who needed to borrow courage and found the lender's door locked. Dawn after dawn, the ritual pressed its thumb into the same bruise. Some men became religious in new ways. They tied threads around their wrists, touched the hafts of their spears 3 times before breakfast, whispered the old blessings like passwords. Others grew efficient at hiding fear inside jokes. They nicknamed the giant in private as if smaller names could shrink him. In public, they spoke with caution because hope, if mishandled, becomes mockery. A pair of brothers argued one afternoon about whether a sling stone could even chip that helmet. They did not argue because an answer could be found. They argued because talking about physics is safer than admitting you might be called to throw. By the second week, the soldiers calculated the giant's appearances to the minute. Men relieved one another from watch just before he came so they could be anywhere else, as though the distance between cook fires and the front line was measured in courage. By the 3rd week, sleep had turned fragile, a thin crust over deep water. Startled awake, men confessed that in their dreams the giant strode through the camp unchallenged, leaning his spear against Saul's tent like a walking stick. They laughed about it in the morning, but the laughter had that hollow center laughter gets when it is doing the work of weeping. The valley itself began to feel owned. You could see it in the way dust rose first from the Philistine side and drifted east, as if even wind had taken a side. You could feel it in the way sound carried. The giant's sentences arrived whole, while the Israelites' replies broke into pieces that fell short of the center. The birds learned his schedule and lifted when he entered the open. If nature keeps your time, your dominance is a kind of weather. On the 40th morning, the Israelites woke to a quiet so clean it sounded like hope had washed the night. For a moment before the ritual began, they imagined disruption. A messenger arriving, a miracle of cloud or fire, a word from the prophet, a sudden sickness in the enemy's camp. They stood a little taller for the length of that imagining. Then the familiar clatter dragged the moment away, and the shape of the giant stepped into view, bright where the sun caught him, dark where the plates overlapped. He paused, as he always did, in that precise patch of ground he had pressed flat with his insisting. There are grooves even fear fits into. A young archer on Israel's ridge lifted his bow by reflex. He had polished it every day to a glow, the string oiled and taut, the arrowhead sharp enough to teach hair to split. He lifted, aimed, lowered. A second archer saw the motion and looked away. Courage is contagious, they say. So is the decision to wait for a better hero. The captains took account with their eyes, not of arrows or rations, but of faces that could still be startled into duty. They adjusted nothing. To adjust would be to admit miscalculation. The giant spoke, and this time he let a new ingredient into his recipe. Scorn shaped like pity. "Is there no man?" he asked slowly, as if speaking to children. He let the sentence stand there naked for the wind to touch, then laughed the way a gate clangs shut. When he turned, the shield-bearer turned with him in practiced harmony. Two halves of a ceremony with no priest and one god. A god made of iron and the belief that whoever speaks loudest owns reality. Evening brought him back, because dread tastes best when served at bedtime. Fires flickered and threw the men's faces upward on tents where their own shadows looked like strangers. One soldier, not yet 20, tightened the strap on his sandal and muttered, "Tomorrow, someone will step out." It was not a prediction or a prayer. It was a way to rent one more night of sleep from the bankruptcy of his nerves. His older cousin nodded as if that settled something, then slipped a small stone into his pocket.
It's time.
Smoother than most, heavy for its size. He had picked it up by a stream days ago without thinking. Now his thumb learned its edges the way a tongue learns a chipped tooth. Across the valley, the Philistine camp made the sound a confident army makes, normal. Laughter, songs about home that did not hurt to sing, dice patted into bowls, the low debate of men arguing over meat. Their champion wandered among them like a favored lion after a parade, slapping backs, throwing lines that drew another round of roaring. They looked at Israel's ridge with the patience of men waiting for a cart to roll downhill. Gravity, they believed, was on their side. On Israel's side, the priests tried to inhale God into the moment. They offered words for forgiveness and words for courage and words for remembrance. The words did their best. But words are not arrows. And in the valley, a man had asked whether there was a man, and the only reply had been the leaf rustle of fear. One priest, old enough to have outlived his certainty, sat down on a warmed rock and whispered a psalm to himself that had not yet been written, about lifting eyes to the hills to ask where help comes from. He looked at the hills and admitted he did not know. Night thinned. The horizon blushed with the color morning puts on like armor. The cooks lit fires early because feeding men is a way to pretend you can feed their courage too. The smell of bread rose and then flattened when the wind turned toward the Philistines. Even aromas seemed to surrender. A captain tried a speech, words borrowed from older victories. Covenant, promise, inheritance. The syllables had muscle memory, but the muscles they remembered belonged to other men on other days. His voice trailed into the small task soldiers used to avoid a large one. Checking a knot, rewrapping a wrist, reheating a cup. He came again. The rhythm demanded him. The valley had no say in it anymore. He stood. He asked. He mocked. The Israelites, as if directed by an invisible conductor, shifted backward a fraction of a step. Not enough to count, enough to confess. A boy who had wandered too near the front to deliver a message to his older brother stopped when the voice hit him and felt the oddest thing. Not terror first, but embarrassment, the hot kind that climbs your neck when someone insults your family in public and nobody answers. He did not yet have the right to speak, so he swallowed the heat and turned the message over in his hands as if he could reduce it by folding. Waiting eats a man from the inside. By midday some paced. Some knelt and retied the same laces twice. One sang under his breath. Another rehearsed in silence the throw he would make if asked to throw, the way the sling would catch the stone, the way his wrist would snap, the way the air would accept the shot. He knew it would not be him. Still, the rehearsal calmed something wild under his ribs. Practice is a kind of prayer for men who have run out of words. The 40th evening lowered its lid. The giant's last appearance of the day had the leisurely cruelty of a cat crossing a courtyard while the mice decide whether to run. He spoke. The echo did what echoes do. Then the valley held the warm hush of fires and talking and the clink of cups. And a shape moved along the ridge road from the south, small, quick, burdened with food wrapped in cloth. No trumpet announced him. No captain tracked his step on a map. He came because his father had said go. He came with bread and cheese and questions he did not yet know he would have to ask out loud. Behind him, Bethlehem finished its chores. The sheep found their pens. A tired dog circled twice and slept. Jesse rubbed his back and wondered how long the war would be a war of waiting. In the valley, men lay down on their shields or sat against their spears and let their eyes close, the day's fear settling into the heavier cousin that visits in dreams. Across the way, the Philistines sang one last song about a god who eats the weak and went to sleep smiling. Morning would bring the ritual because rituals hold until someone breaks them. The Israelites did not expect the breaker to be the messenger they would meet at the baggage line. Ruddy, bright-eyed, with a harp's calluses and a sling's competence, a boy who looked at giants and saw an equation he had solved before in fields where lions had learned to regret their choices. But that belongs to another moment. For now, the valley belonged to the voice that had taught men to retreat without moving. It belonged to the champion whose shadow trained the courage out of an army. It belonged to the question he kept asking, "Is there no man?" And it belonged to the answer no one quite dared shape with his mouth, though many had already shaped it with their feet. Yet an answer was walking. It did not know it was an answer yet. Answers rarely do until the question stands close enough to measure. The 40th day was no different in ritual. The Philistine champion had stepped into the valley that morning, roared his challenge, and returned to his camp with the same laughter that had haunted Israel for weeks. By now, the Israelites had resigned themselves to the pattern. They no longer expected change. They merely endured. But on that same morning, long before the echoes faded from the hills, another figure began a journey toward the battlefield, one that no soldier anticipated and none would have chosen. David, the youngest son of Jesse, had woken early in Bethlehem to the bleating of sheep. He was a shepherd first, a musician when his flock was still, and a runner when his father needed errands completed. He was not of the age for war. His brothers, 3 of them, had taken their places in Saul's army. David remained at home, tending to the fields. But Jesse, old and worried, needed news from the front. His sons had been gone too long, and a father's heart grows heavy without word. So he called for David, handed him sacks of roasted grain and loaves of bread, and added a gift of cheese for the commander of his son's unit. "Take these to your brothers," Jesse instructed, "and bring me back a report." The task was simple. Deliver supplies, return with news. David should have been nothing more than a messenger. Yet history often turns on errands, and wars sometimes shift not by kings or generals, but by boys carrying bread. The road from Bethlehem to the Valley of Elah was rough, winding through the hills where olive groves stood in scattered patches and the scent of wild thyme clung to the air. David walked quickly, the weight of his provisions balanced across his shoulders. Along the way he hummed melodies he had composed under the stars, songs meant to calm sheep at night or to praise the God who watched over them. The journey was familiar, but the destination was not. He had heard rumors of conflict but knew little of the details. To him, war was still an idea, a distant noise. He had never seen an army assembled, never smelled the iron tang of too many weapons gathered in one place. He walked without fear because he did not yet know what fear the valley held. By the time David neared the Israelite camp, the sun had risen high enough to burn away the haze. He heard the first notes of commotion long before he saw it, the clash of shields, the shouted orders of captains, the low rumble of thousands of men moving in unison. His pace quickened, curiosity tugging him forward. As he crested the final ridge, the sight opened before him like a stage curtain pulled wide. 2 armies stretched across opposite hillsides, banners whipping in the wind. Between them lay the valley floor, barren save for the scarred ground where the giant had walked. David paused, his breath catching. To his eyes, trained on sheep and streams, the scene was overwhelming. The colors alone, bronze glinting, crimson cloth snapping, dust rising like smoke, were enough to fix him in place. But the sound, the living roar of thousands preparing for battle, pressed into his chest. He stood still only a moment before duty nudged him on. Slinging his sack to the camp's edge, he found the keeper of supplies and left the goods in his care, then hurried toward the front to seek his brothers. He wove through clusters of men tightening straps and sharpening blades, nodding politely to soldiers who barely noticed him. He caught glimpses of faces lined with exhaustion, hands calloused from endless waiting. When he found his brothers, he greeted them with the warmth of one who had missed them deeply. They answered with the distracted impatience of men preoccupied with survival. The battlefield did not allow for tender reunions. It was then, as he spoke to them, that the sound came again, the voice he had never heard but which had shaped Israel's fear for over a month. Across the valley, the Philistine champion strode forward, his bronze armor ablaze in the sun. His steps were measured, unhurried, the steps of someone who owned the ground beneath him. The soldiers of Israel, hardened though they were, recoiled as if the air itself had grown toxic. The lines they had formed broke like water against stone. Men who had shouted moments earlier now melted backward, their shields raised as though against an invisible storm. David froze, eyes locked on the figure who now stood in the valley's center. He had never seen a man so large. Even from a distance, the proportions were wrong, exaggerated, a caricature of strength made flesh. But what struck David was not the giant's size. It was his words. The voice carried, bold and mocking. "Why do you come to line up for battle?" Goliath thundered. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man. Let him come down to me." David's ears rang not with fear but with fury. He looked around and saw grown men, soldiers, warriors, veterans of campaigns, fleeing from a single voice, and in that voice he heard more than challenge. He heard insult, blasphemy against the God of Israel. His chest burned hot, not with terror but with indignation. He turned to the men nearest him and demanded, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The soldiers stared at him, stunned by the audacity of youth. To them, the words sounded naive, reckless. They explained quickly, almost dismissively. The king had promised wealth, his daughter's hand in marriage, an exemption from taxes for the family of any man who defeated the giant. Their tone made clear that such promises were meaningless, for no man had dared attempt it. But David did not flinch. The offer was irrelevant. What mattered was the insult to God and to Israel's honor. His question was not born of arrogance but of clarity. Where others saw only an impossible enemy, he saw a defiance that demanded an answer. Word of his defiance spread quickly through the camp. Some scoffed. Others whispered that the boy was mad. His eldest brother, Eliab, burned with embarrassment and anger. He pulled David aside, hissing with scorn. "Why have you come down here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You came only to watch the battle." David met his brother's eyes, unshaken. "What have I done now? Was it not just a question?" He answered, his tone firm but not disrespectful. He turned away before Eliab could silence him further, his eyes already scanning for someone who might listen. The murmurs reached Saul's ears. A boy in the camp, they said, had spoken boldly where men had grown silent. The king, weary of 40 days of shame, summoned David. The soldiers expected the matter to end there, with Saul dismissing the youth as foolish. But history is made of moments when expectations fail. The tent of King Saul stood slightly apart from the rest of the camp, a space guarded by soldiers who wore the weight of fatigue in their eyes. The murmur of the army did not easily penetrate its walls, but on this day, whispers moved quickly enough to reach the king's ears. A boy, they said, had spoken with boldness. A boy had dared to suggest what no man had. At first, Saul might have dismissed it as camp gossip, the sort of wild talk men invent to distract themselves from fear. But the rumor grew persistent, and in the end, the king gave the order, "Bring him here." David entered the tent without ceremony, his shepherd's staff still in hand. the pouch at his side. He looked nothing like a warrior, and his youth was plain in his face. Saul, taller than any of his men, regarded him with a mix of curiosity and weariness. The king's armor lay stacked nearby, polished but unused, as though mocking its owner. The silence stretched before Saul finally spoke, his voice heavy with disbelief. "You are but a youth," he said, "and this Philistine has been a warrior since his youth. How can you stand against him?" David stepped forward, his eyes steady, and spoke with a conviction that belied his age. "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." The words rang with a clarity that startled even the king's attendants. Saul leaned back, perhaps expecting bravado to crumble under scrutiny, but David's tone carried no trace of jest. He was utterly sincere. The boy continued, his voice low but resolute. "Your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. When it rose against me, I seized it by its beard and struck it down. I have killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." He paused, his chest rising with breath, then added with quiet certainty, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." The tent seemed to shrink with the weight of those words. For weeks, fear had been the camp's only language. To hear faith spoken aloud, clear and uncompromising, was like hearing a foreign tongue. Saul studied the boy, perhaps searching for arrogance, for madness, for some sign that would justify dismissal. But he found only conviction. In that moment, Saul understood that this was not the stubbornness of a reckless child. It was the steadiness of a soul convinced that God himself would act. The king exhaled slowly, and his decision surprised even himself. "Go," he said, his voice almost a whisper, then louder with the formality of a blessing. "Go, and may the Lord be with you." No sooner had the words left his lips than attendants moved to prepare the boy. They brought Saul's own armor, the best in the camp, heavy plates forged for a king. They placed the bronze helmet on David's head, strapped the coat of mail around his chest, and fastened the sword at his side. To the men watching, the ritual must have seemed symbolic, a way to cloak the shepherd in legitimacy, to dress him as a warrior even if he was not one. But when David took a few tentative steps, the weight of the gear betrayed him. He stumbled, his movements stiff and unnatural. He tried once more, adjusting his stride, but the truth became plain. This armor was not his. "I cannot go with these," David said, shaking his head. "I am not used to them." And with calm deliberation, he removed each piece. The helmet, the coat, the sword. The attendants watched in silence as the boy stood once more in the plain garments of a shepherd. To some, it must have looked like folly. To others, perhaps, it was the first glimpse of authenticity, a man unwilling to pretend he was something he was not. He took up instead the tools he trusted. His staff, smooth with years of use, and the sling he had wielded countless times in the fields. From a nearby stream, he selected 5 smooth stones, weighing each in his hand before slipping them into the pouch at his side. To any soldier in Saul's army, the sight must have bordered on absurdity. A boy armed with stones against a giant clad in bronze. Yet in David's eyes, there was no absurdity at all. There was only purpose. Saul watched him, perhaps torn between the desperation of his position and the unlikely hope the boy offered. For 40 days, no man had answered the challenge. And now, here stood one, unarmed by the standards of men but armored in faith. What choice did the king have but to let him try? To forbid it would be to silence the only voice of courage to rise in weeks. To allow it was to risk ridicule and despair if the boy fell. Yet Saul had no other options left. His silence had already cost his army their courage. Perhaps the faith of one boy could do what his crown could not. The tent emptied as word spread. A ripple of disbelief moved through the camp. The shepherd would face the giant. Men whispered in astonishment, some shaking their heads, others muttering prayers. A few laughed bitterly, certain they were about to watch folly lead to slaughter. But in the hearts of some, long buried beneath layers of fear, a spark flickered. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of it. David stepped out into the sunlight, the valley before him stretching wide. The ridges echoed with the murmur of soldiers, the Philistines already stirring as the news reached them. Across the way, the giant was rising, his massive frame gleaming as he prepared once more for the ritual he believed would never end. The stage was set, as it had been every morning and evening. But today, for the first time in 40 days, someone was walking forward to meet him. The valley, long accustomed to silence after Goliath's roar, now hummed with an energy it had not felt in 40 days. From the Philistine ridge, soldiers leaned forward, their laughter already building as they watched the small figure step out from the Israelite line. From Israel's ridge, men crowded to the edge, their disbelief colliding with dread. For weeks they had waited for a champion, some towering warrior clad in steel, a man who might at least look capable of challenging the monster. Instead, a boy walked alone, no armor upon his shoulders, no sword at his side, only a shepherd's staff and a sling resting lightly in his hand. Goliath saw him and slowed, confusion flickering across his scarred face before giving way to scorn. He had expected at least a contest worth boasting about. Instead, Israel had sent a child. His laughter boomed across the valley, cruel and confident. He spat upon the ground and called out, his voice dripping with contempt. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" His curses rose, invoking the gods of Philistia, words sharp enough to cut the air. He raised his spear slightly, not as an attack but as an insult, promising in a growl that he would feed the boy's flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. The Israelites on the ridge shuddered, some covering their faces, unwilling to watch what they believed would be slaughter. The Philistines roared in approval, their champion's words echoing their certainty of victory. In their minds, the battle was already won. But David did not flinch. His grip tightened on the sling, his eyes steady, his voice clear enough to cut through the giant's thunder. "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin," he called out. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the corpses of the Philistine army to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth, that all the world may know there is a God in Israel." The words rang across the valley, carried by more than lungs. They carried the weight of faith. Israel's soldiers stirred, their ears catching a sound they had not heard in weeks: defiance. On the Philistine side, the laughter dimmed, replaced with unease. It was not that they believed the boy could win, but something in his tone unsettled them. He spoke not like prey but like a hunter. Goliath bared his teeth, fury flushing his face. He surged forward, his shield-bearer scrambling to keep pace. The ground shook beneath his massive stride, dust kicking up with each step. To the Israelites watching, the sight was unbearable. A mountain of bronze hurtling toward a boy with nothing but leather and stone. But David did not wait. He ran forward as well, his steps light, the sling already in motion. The cords whirled in a blur, the pouch holding a single smooth stone chosen from the stream. Centrifugal force built with each rotation, the air hissing around it. The rhythm was one David knew as intimately as his own heartbeat. He had used it countless times against predators in the fields. The sling was no toy. In the right hands, it was a weapon of terrifying speed. Stones loosed from such slings could travel over 100 miles per hour, striking with the force of a bullet. David's hand released, and the stone sang through the air. The Philistine giant lifted his eyes, perhaps catching the movement too late. The stone found its mark, striking the only unprotected place, the forehead, just above the ridge of the helmet. The impact cracked bone, embedding itself deep. Goliath's expression froze, disbelief etched in muscle, before his body betrayed him. He staggered, knees buckling, arms flailing as if to grasp at the impossible. Then, with a sound like thunder rolling down the valley, the giant collapsed face first into the earth. Dust rose in a choking cloud. The earth shook under the weight of his fall. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Neither army moved. The Israelites held their breath, scarcely daring to believe. The Philistines gaped, their certainty shattering in an instant. The giant who had owned the valley for 40 days lay motionless in the dirt, slain not by sword or spear, but by a shepherd's stone. David did not pause. He ran to the fallen body, climbed upon the armored chest, and seized the massive sword still sheathed at Goliath's side. With effort, he drew it free, the blade gleaming cruelly in the sun. The boy who moments earlier had carried only a sling now lifted a weapon fit for a giant. With a decisive stroke, he ended what the stone had begun. The Philistine's head was severed, raised high for all to see. The valley erupted. Israel's ridge exploded with a roar, years of humiliation burning away in an instant of triumph. The men who had hidden in fear now surged forward, shouting until their throats burned. Courage, dormant for weeks, returned in a flood. Across the valley, panic seized the Philistines. Their champion, their god of war, their guarantee was gone. And with his fall, so too fell their confidence. They turned, terror undoing their ranks, and fled toward the gates of Ekron. The Israelites did not hesitate. With a shout that seemed to split the sky, they charged. Spears leveled, swords drawn. They poured into the valley, trampling the ground once owned by fear. The chase carried them beyond the battlefield, through the plain, all the way to the Philistine strongholds. Along the way, bodies fell, armor clattered, weapons lay abandoned. The rout was complete. Back in the valley, David still stood over the giant's body, the severed head in his grip. To some, the sight was grotesque, but to Israel it was proof incarnate. The God they served had delivered them. The boy who had carried bread and cheese that morning now carried victory in his hands. When the dust settled and the shouting dimmed, the soldiers of Israel returned, plundering the Philistine camp. Among them, eyes kept drifting back to David, the shepherd who had done what no warrior dared. The image of him standing over the fallen giant would be etched into memory, retold in whispers that would soon swell into legend. The head of Goliath would be carried eventually to Jerusalem, a grim trophy, while the giant's weapons were placed in David's tent. But more enduring than relics was the lesson seared into every witness. The strength of a man does not rest in height, armor, or weapons. It rests in the courage to step forward when no one else will, and in the faith that the battle belongs not to human hands alone. For 40 days, Goliath's voice had ruled the valley. In a single moment, that voice was silenced, replaced by the shout of a boy who had seen lions and bears fall and knew that giants were no different. And though the armies would march again, and wars would rise anew, Israel would never forget the day the valley changed owners. The day a shepherd walked into fear and left it slain at his feet. The echo of the giant's fall still lingered in the valley when the Israelites found their voices again. At first it was disbelief, men staring in stunned silence at the shepherd boy who now stood over the massive corpse. Dust curled in the air around David, drifting in pale ribbons as the severed head of Goliath dangled from his hand. The sight was grotesque, yes, but it was also undeniable. The man who had terrified them for 40 days was dead. The challenge that had hung over them like a storm cloud had vanished with the crack of a single stone. A murmur rose from the Israelite line, small at first, then swelling, rippling outward like a wave gathering strength. Men who had hidden behind shields now threw them aside, raising their swords and spears high, voices uniting in a roar that shook the hills. It was as if courage itself had returned, rushing back into their bones the way floodwaters rush into a dry riverbed. Fear that had ruled them for weeks was burned away in an instant of collective release. Their champion had not been a warrior in steel, but a boy with faith, and somehow that made their triumph even more astonishing. Across the valley, the Philistines saw what their minds refused to accept. Their giant, their symbol of invincibility, was nothing more than a corpse on the ground. The strength they had borrowed from him evaporated at once. Panic spread through their ranks, disorder unraveling their formations. Soldiers who had been so confident now turned to flee, discarding shields and weapons as they ran. Terror is contagious, and in that moment it leapt from man to man like fire through dry grass. The Israelites surged forward, pouring down the slope in a thunder of footsteps. The valley that had been a stage for fear became a channel of pursuit. Shouts filled the air, steel clashed against steel as the retreating Philistines stumbled into the oncoming tide. The Israelites cut through them with the fury of men avenging 40 days of humiliation. Dust rose in choking clouds, the cries of the fleeing mingling with the battle cries of the pursuers. The chase did not end in the valley. The Philistines ran northward, toward the gates of Ekron, desperate to reach the safety of their walled city. Israel pressed them relentlessly, striking them down along the road, leaving the bodies of the fallen scattered across the path. The battlefield stretched for miles, a trail of shattered shields, broken spears, and lifeless warriors marking the path of retreat. The land that had once seemed theirs was littered now with the cost of their arrogance. From the ridges, shepherd boys too young to fight watched the rout with wide eyes. Only that morning Israel had looked beaten, broken by fear. Now the same men who had trembled at a voice became lions, their courage reborn in the shadow of a boy's victory. It was not simply a battle being won. It was a nation rediscovering itself. The Philistines tried to rally at Gath, but Israel pressed them still. They attempted to regroup at Ekron, yet the tide had already turned. What had begun as mockery, a boy sent against a giant, ended in catastrophe for them. Their greatest warrior was gone, and with him the illusion of their invincibility. Meanwhile, back in the valley, David still stood beside the fallen giant. He had no part in the pursuit. His battle was already won. The weight of Goliath's sword still lingered in his hand, its size almost comical against his youth. He placed it aside and lifted the severed head once more, not as an act of cruelty but as proof. Proof for Israel that fear had been conquered, proof for the Philistines that their terror no longer held sway. The boy who had carried bread and cheese at dawn now carried the symbol of victory by dusk. When the Israelite army finally returned from the chase, their arms heavy with plunder, they gathered around the valley in awe. Their voices were hoarse from shouting, their limbs weary from pursuit, but their eyes burned with something they had not felt in weeks: pride. They looked upon David not merely as a shepherd, nor even as a warrior, but as the instrument through which their God had delivered them. In their hearts, they knew they would tell their children of this day. David carried the head of Goliath with him as he walked toward the camp. Soldiers stepped aside to let him pass, some reaching out to touch his shoulder, others bowing their heads as he went. Saul's officers trailed him, whispering among themselves. The boy had done what none of them had dared, and the weight of that truth pressed heavily on their minds. When he entered the presence of Saul once more, the camp fell silent. The boy stood before the king, blood still fresh on his hands, the giant's head a grisly trophy at his side. Saul studied him, his expression unreadable, torn between relief, astonishment, and perhaps a shadow of envy. "Whose son are you, young man?" the king asked, his voice carrying more curiosity than command. David answered simply, without flourish, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." The words were humble, yet in them lay the beginning of a story that would stretch far beyond this valley. That night, the camp did not sleep easily. Victory's aftermath carried its own weight. Fires burned across the hills, soldiers feasting on the spoils of the Philistines, their laughter echoing in the darkness. Yet amid the revelry, a quiet unease lingered. They had seen something impossible, something that defied their understanding of war. A shepherd had slain a giant, not by strength of arm, but by faith. Some marveled, others whispered, but none could deny that the world had shifted. The valley, once a theater of humiliation, had become a monument to deliverance. The ground where fear had ruled for 40 days now bore the imprint of victory. Men walked its soil differently, as though it had been consecrated by what had happened there. The memory of Goliath's voice would linger, yes, but it would be silenced by the louder memory of his fall. For David, the journey was only beginning. The head of Goliath would soon be carried to Jerusalem, a grim symbol for Israel to remember. His weapons would be placed in David's own tent, the boy claiming spoils of war like any seasoned warrior. Yet these trophies were less significant than the shift within the people. They had seen courage embodied in unexpected form, and that vision would shape them for years to come. The pursuit was over, the Philistines scattered. But the story of that day had only just begun to ripple outward. From shepherds in the hills to merchants in the cities, from soldiers' wives waiting at home to children listening at firesides, the tale would spread. How a boy walked into a valley alone and walked out with the fear of a nation in his hand. And with every retelling, the lesson grew clearer, that giants fall not because they are weak, but because faith makes even the smallest hand strong enough to strike them down. Years passed after the day in the Valley of Elah, yet the shadow of giants did not vanish from Israel's memory. David grew from a boy into a warrior, no longer just the shepherd who had felled Goliath, but the leader of men, the one who carried with him the weight of destiny. Victories followed him, and songs rose in his name, sung by women in the streets. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. With each campaign, his reputation deepened, his enemies more determined, his battles more relentless. But with the passage of years came also the weight of time. Even heroes grow weary. Even kings, though chosen and anointed, carry bodies of flesh that tire, bleed, and falter. One day, in the midst of yet another war with the Philistines, David marched once more with his men. The enemy had not forgotten him, nor the humiliation their giant had suffered years earlier. They longed to see Israel's champion cut down, not by fate but by their own hands. Among them was a warrior named Ishbi-Benob, a descendant of the giants of Gath, kin to Goliath himself. His spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and he carried a new sword gleaming with cruel promise. In his heart burned a singular desire, to be the one who slew David. The battle was fierce, dust swirling as swords clashed and cries of war rang across the field. David, though still a man of immense skill, felt the burden of years pressing against his strength. His arms did not swing with the same relentless energy as they had in youth. His chest heaved heavier, his feet slowed more quickly. Yet still he pressed on, unwilling to retreat, unwilling to abandon his men to face the Philistines without him. He had built his life upon courage, and even as his body betrayed him, his spirit refused to yield. Ishbi-Benob saw his chance. Amid the chaos of battle, he marked David's slowing steps, the weariness settling into his movements. With a surge of fury, the giant's descendant pressed forward, his spear glinting in the sun, his sword raised high. To him, this was more than combat. It was vengeance for a fallen brother, for a legacy of giants slain by Israel's hand. He bore down upon David with the strength of his lineage, and for the first time since his youth, David felt the cold hand of peril tighten around him. The clash was brutal. David parried, his sword ringing against the Philistines' heavy weapon. Sparks leapt from the impact, sweat streaming into his eyes as he fought to keep his footing. Ishbi-Benob's strength was monstrous, each strike hammering with the force of iron against stone. David staggered under the weight, his muscles straining, his breath ragged. The memories of lions and bears, of Goliath falling in the valley, seemed suddenly distant, almost like stories told to another man. This was not a duel of youth. This was survival against a foe who had chosen him specifically, who would not rest until he saw him dead. And David faltered. His sword slipped against the enemies. His footing slid upon the churned earth. Ishbi-Benob lifted his weapon high, the sun catching on the bronze, and for a breath the fate of Israel's king hung upon the edge of a blade. But heroes are not always saved by their own strength. In that moment, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah and nephew of David, surged forward. He had been fighting elsewhere in the fray, but his eyes had not strayed far from his king. Loyalty burned within him, fierce and uncompromising. He saw the peril, saw the giant's descendant about to strike, and without hesitation he threw himself into the storm. His spear found its mark, striking with the force of desperation and devotion combined. Ishbi-Benob reeled, his moment of triumph stolen, his life torn away in an instant. The battlefield seemed to pause, as though even war itself respected what had happened. Abishai stood over his king, chest heaving, eyes blazing with the fire of loyalty. David, weary and shaken, looked upon the man who had saved him and knew the truth that every leader eventually learns. No victory is won alone. Even the greatest must sometimes be carried by the devotion of others. In the aftermath, David's men gathered around him, their voices firm, their faces grave. They swore an oath that day, speaking with one voice, "You shall not go out with us to battle anymore, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." The words carried weight deeper than command. David was more than their king. He was their light, the one through whom God had given deliverance, the symbol of their hope. To lose him recklessly in battle would be to darken the future of the nation itself. From that day, David's place would no longer be on the front lines, sword raised against every foe. His battles would be fought differently, through leadership, strategy, and faith. Abishai's act was more than a rescue. It was a reminder that courage is not the burden of one man alone. The same God who had given victory to a shepherd against a giant now gave strength to a nephew to save a king. The pattern of deliverance did not rest upon a single hand but upon a people bound by loyalty, bound by covenant, bound by their trust in something greater than themselves. The story of Abishai spread quickly among the soldiers. They spoke of his speed, his strength, the precision of his strike. But more than that, they spoke of his devotion, that he would risk his life without thought, without hesitation, to save David. In campfires after the battle, men told the tale not merely as history but as inspiration, a lesson in brotherhood. For every Israelite, the truth became clear. Giants still roamed the earth, but so did men willing to stand in the breach for one another. David, for his part, carried the memory heavily. He had built his youth on defiance of fear, on the certainty that God would deliver him. Yet in that moment with Ishbi-benob, he had tasted the frailty of age, the reality that no man remains invincible forever. His gratitude toward Abishai was profound, not only because his life had been spared, but because the rescue revealed the enduring presence of God's providence. Where his strength ended, another's had begun. Where his arm failed, another's had risen. As the army moved forward, the war with the Philistines continued, but David no longer stood at the vanguard. His men carried that burden, emboldened by their loyalty, fueled by the example of Abishai. The king's role shifted, but his significance did not wane. If anything, it deepened, for Israel saw that even their greatest hero could stumble, and in that weakness, they discovered the power of unity. Their hope was not anchored in the strength of one man's arm, but in the God who sent help at the exact moment it was needed. The battlefield where Abishai saved David became part of Israel's living memory, a place spoken of in the same breath as the Valley of Elah. Parents told their children not only of the boy who slew the giant, but also of the nephew who saved the king. And woven through both stories was the same thread. God does not abandon his people, and he raises deliverers in the moments they are most needed. For David, the lesson was humbling. In his youth, he had faced danger alone, armed only with a sling and faith. In his age, he faced danger again, and God reminded him that deliverance can come through the hands of others. Giants fell then, and giants fell now, not because men were strong, but because God was faithful. Abishai remained at David's side for years to come, not only as rescuer but as commander, trusted beyond many others. He would be remembered among the mighty men, his name etched into the chronicles of Israel. But for David, Abishai would always be more than a warrior. He would be the proof that no man, however great, fights alone. The death of Goliath had not ended the line of giants. His fall in the Valley of Elah silenced one voice, but echoes of his kind still stalked the land. In the years that followed, Israel learned that giants were not singular marvels but part of a darker heritage woven into the Philistine strongholds. Descendants of the Rephaim, remnants of the Anakim, these figures carried both the bloodline and the legend of their monstrous kin. Each battle against them was more than a clash of armies. It was a confrontation with the very embodiment of fear that had haunted Israel since the days of their fathers. One such giant was named Saph, a towering figure whose frame dwarfed most men. When battle came again between Israel and the Philistines, Saph stood among their champions. His stature was immense, his spear like a tree branch cut from the forests of Bashan. To the Philistines, he was their reassurance that the terror of Goliath had not died with him. To the Israelites, he was a reminder that fear returns, again and again, to test the strength of faith. Yet Saph's story ended not in triumph but in defeat. Among David's warriors was a man named Sibbecai the Hushathite, one of the mighty men, seasoned in war and unyielding in loyalty. When Saph rose against Israel, Sibbecai met him with the courage born from years of following David. The clash was brutal, the giant's power formidable, but Sibbecai's blade found its mark, and Saph fell. Another giant silenced, another shadow banished. The people whispered that once again God had delivered, and that David's courage had inspired others to fight giants of their own. But Saph was not the only one. There was Lami, described as the brother of Goliath, whose spear shaft was as thick as a weaver's beam. The memory of Goliath's weapon had already seared itself into Israel's history, and Lami carried that legacy forward, his weapon a symbol of continuity, as though the giant's defeat had been avenged by his kin. Yet Lami too found his end, struck down by Elhanan the son of Jair. The records note little else, but in that brief account lies a truth. David was not alone in slaying giants. The courage that had begun with a shepherd in the valley had spread, like fire catching dry wood, to the men who followed him. Where once Israel had trembled at a single voice, now their warriors met giants as foes to be defeated, not monsters to be feared. There was also the unnamed giant of Gath, a man so strange and terrible that the scriptures remembered him for the peculiar deformity of his hands and feet. 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in all. His very body carried the mark of something unnatural, a grotesque echo of the fallen Nephilim. In the eyes of the Philistines, perhaps this deformity was seen as a sign of greater strength, a blessing of monstrous inheritance. To Israel, it was simply another threat. He taunted them as Goliath once had, his stature and form designed to intimidate. But his arrogance cost him. He was struck down by Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother. Once more, a giant fell, not to the might of Philistia but to the resolve of Israel's God and the courage of his people. The stories of these giants might have seemed separate, scattered across different battlefields and years, but woven together, they formed a pattern. Fear may rise repeatedly, but faith rises to meet it. Giants were not limited to the days of Goliath. They were a recurring trial, each one daring Israel to forget the lesson already taught, that the battle belongs not to the strong, nor to the armored, but to the Lord. The men who slew these giants were not remembered merely for their skill, but for their willingness to step forward, echoing the courage of David in the valley years earlier. The Philistines must have believed that sending giants would always tilt the scale in their favor. Their society revered strength, size, intimidation. They trusted in the spectacle of height and the weight of iron. To them, warfare was as much psychological as physical. But time and again, they learned that what terrifies men does not terrify God. Each giant's fall was not just a tactical victory. It was a theological proclamation, a declaration that fear could not reign where faith stood. Around the fires of Israel's camp, the soldiers told these stories to one another. They spoke of Sibbecai striking down Saph, of Elhanan felling Lami, of Jonathan killing the 6-fingered giant. Their voices carried pride, yes, but also relief. For these tales were not just history. They were reminders that God had not abandoned them, that his power extended beyond a single miraculous day in Elah. What had begun with a sling and a stone had continued through sword and spear, through men willing to believe that giants could fall. In the villages, mothers told their children of the giants who had risen and been struck down. The stories grew into lessons, that arrogance leads to downfall, that faith endures, that no enemy is too great when God fights for his people. Children who once trembled at the thought of monsters now laughed as they recited the names of Israel's warriors. Fear had been turned into memory, memory into strength. Yet even as giants fell, their presence left questions. Who were these beings? whose stature defied nature, whose hands bore more fingers than men should have. Whispers of the Nephilim returned, the old legends of Genesis, the tales of angels and mortals intermingling to produce men of renown. Scholars debated whether these giants were remnants of that ancient corruption or simply the result of bloodlines stretched by the mysteries of heredity. Whatever their origin, one truth remained: their might had not saved them. For all their size, for all their intimidation, they lay in the dust before the God of Israel. The memory of these victories shaped Israel's spirit for generations. It was no longer the story of one boy against one giant. It was the story of a nation that learned, through repeated trial, that giants fall. Each descendant of Goliath who rose against them was not a terror but a test, and each defeat strengthened the legacy of faith. The people carried these lessons into their worship, into their songs, into the marrow of their identity. They knew now that courage was not a rare gift but a flame that could spread from one man to many, from a shepherd to a kingdom. When David reflected on these battles in his later years, perhaps he saw more clearly than anyone how God had shaped the arc of his story. Goliath had been the beginning, but not the end. Saph, Lami, the six-fingered giant, each had been part of a larger narrative, a reminder that fear returns in cycles, but so does faith. And just as his hand had once hurled a stone in defiance of a giant, the hands of others had risen to strike their own blows. His victory was not meant to stand alone. It was meant to inspire, and it had. So the chronicles remembered these men, the slayers of giants, and placed their names beside David's. For though giants may have walked the earth, Israel learned this truth. The measure of a man is not in his stature, nor the weight of his weapons, but in the strength of his heart when he stands before impossible odds. Giants fall, but courage endures. The echoes of battle fade, but stories endure. Long after the dust of the Valley of Elah settled, long after the Philistine armies scattered and the giants fell one by one, the story of David and Goliath lived on. It was told first in hushed tones around campfires, soldiers recalling the impossible sight of a shepherd boy stepping forward when no one else dared. Then it spread into villages, whispered by merchants, sung by women drawing water, repeated by children who ran through the fields pretending to sling stones. Soon it became not just a memory but a monument, etched into the very identity of Israel. The outcome of that single duel was larger than the death of a giant. It reshaped how Israel saw itself. For 40 days, their army had cowered, paralyzed by fear. They had looked at the Philistine champion and seen only defeat. But when David stepped forward, they saw something else. The possibility that faith could defy reason, that courage could overturn the expected, that victory could come from the most unlikely place. From that day, the people began to believe not merely in David, but in what his courage represented. They saw that their strength did not rest in numbers, nor in armor, nor in the size of their warriors, but in the God who fought for them. Generations later, the story still carried power. When men spoke of impossible odds, they spoke of giants. When they spoke of courage, they spoke of shepherds with slings. The duel became a metaphor, a lens through which they viewed their struggles. Every enemy that seemed insurmountable was called a Goliath, every underdog a David. The language of faith had been forever shaped by that encounter. For David himself, the outcome was more complex. His victory brought him into the court of Saul, into the eye of public acclaim, into the dangerous currents of jealousy and politics. The women's songs, celebrating his tens of thousands, stoked Saul's envy, and from that envy grew years of pursuit, exile, and conflict. The victory that had made him a hero also made him a target. Such is often the case with triumphs. They carry both crown and cross. Yet even in the years of wandering, David carried with him the memory of that valley. It was proof, indelible and unshakable, that God was with him. If the Lord had delivered him from lions and bears, and from a giant armed with bronze, then surely he could deliver him from kings and armies. The legacy of Goliath's fall also marked the Philistines. Their aura of invincibility was shattered. They could never again stride onto the battlefield with the same certainty. No matter how many soldiers they mustered, no matter what weapons they forged, the memory of that boy with a sling haunted them. It told them that strength was not always enough, that their greatest champion had been undone not by superior force but by faith. To be defeated by a stronger army is one thing. To be defeated by a shepherd is humiliation. That humiliation lingered, gnawing at their pride. But the legacy extended beyond Israel and Philistia. It became a universal truth. Across cultures and centuries, men and women would return to the image of a boy facing a giant and find in it a mirror for their own struggles. Kings fighting empires, slaves yearning for freedom, inventors challenging impossibility. All saw themselves in David. The sling and the stone became symbols, not of primitive warfare, but of courage wielded against overwhelming odds. The lesson of the story was never about the stone itself, nor the skill of the sling. It was about what moved the hand that cast it. David himself said it plainly, "The battle is the Lord's." And in that proclamation lies the heart of the legacy. The outcome was not random, not chance, not luck. It was the visible proof of an invisible hand guiding history. The stone struck true not only because it was well aimed, but because it was destined to. In time, David would become king, his throne established, his kingdom expanded. But even at the height of his power, the shadow of that valley remained with him. It kept him humble, reminding him that his rise had begun not with armies but with faith. When he sat upon the throne in Jerusalem, he was still the boy who had once looked up at a giant and declared that God would deliver him. That memory anchored him, shaped his prayers, and filled his psalms with imagery of deliverance. "Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear," he would write, his words echoing the courage of that day. Yet the legacy also carried warnings. For in later years, when David's strength waned and his men swore he should no longer risk himself in battle, it became clear that no man remains forever the giant slayer. Even heroes grow weary, even kings falter. The lesson shifted. Courage must be carried forward by others. And so it was. His mighty men struck down Saph, Lami, and the six-fingered giant. The torch of courage passed from David's hand into theirs, proving that the spirit of faith does not die with one man but lives in those he inspires. That, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. Goliath's defeat was not the end of giants, but it was the beginning of a people who knew they could be faced. Fear might rise again, but so would courage. Giants might roar, but so would faith. And the memory of one boy in one valley ensured that Israel would never again see their enemies as unconquerable. The outcome of that single sling stone stretched far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped a nation, altered the balance of power, and gave birth to a story that would live wherever men and women faced impossible odds. And the legacy? It whispered through the centuries that giants fall. Not because they are weak, but because God is strong. Not because the underdog is lucky, but because faith turns weakness into victory. In the end, the valley became more than a place of war. It became a symbol. To walk into a valley of giants is to confront every fear, every obstacle, every impossible challenge. To walk out victorious is to carry with you not just triumph but testimony, that faith can topple anything that rises against it. And so the story endures. Parents tell it to children, teachers tell it to students, preachers tell it to congregations. Artists paint it, poets sing it, and warriors remember it before their own battles. Each time it is told, the outcome is the same. The giant falls, the shepherd stands, and the world remembers that courage is greater than fear. The head of Goliath may have long since turned to dust, his weapons rusted and forgotten, but the story remains sharper than any sword, heavier than any spear. It is not just Israel's story. It is humanity's. It is the reminder that when we face the giants of our own lives, be they enemies, doubts, or impossible odds, we walk not alone. And though the battlefield may change, the outcome echoes the same. Giants fall. Faith endures. The story of David and Goliath is often told as the ultimate underdog tale, but its message reaches far beyond a single duel in an ancient valley. At its heart, it is a reminder of how fear shapes us, and how faith can break its grip. For 40 days, Israel trembled because they measured themselves against the giant. But David measured the giant against God. That shift in perspective changed everything. Life is full of giants, obstacles that tower over us, challenges that seem impossible to overcome, voices that taunt us into silence. Most of the time, those giants are not flesh and blood. They are doubt, despair, addiction, injustice, or the crushing weight of expectations. They loom large, convincing us that we are too small, too weak, too unequipped. Yet the story insists that size is not the deciding factor, faith is. David's victory did not erase giants from the world. In fact, other giants rose later, faced by his men. But that is part of the legacy. His courage was contagious. It showed that faith and courage are not reserved for heroes. They are choices anyone can make. Giants will always rise, but they will also always fall. The lesson is not just about winning battles. It's about daring to step forward when fear tells us to stay still. It's about believing that the impossible can be confronted. And it's about recognizing that the greatest victories often come from the most unlikely hands. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit the like button and share it with someone who might be facing their own giants today. Subscribe to our channel because we bring you more incredible stories from history. Tales of courage, resilience, and moments that changed the world. Now we want to hear from you. What's the biggest giant you've ever faced in your life? Was it fear, doubt, or something you thought you could never overcome? Drop your answer in the comments. We read everyone, and your story might inspire someone else. And if you enjoyed this video, you won't want to miss tomorrow's episode. We'll be uncovering another historical showdown that proves truth is often stranger than fiction. History isn't just about the past. It's about the lessons that carry forward into our lives today. So join us, be part of the conversation, and let's keep learning together.